Yep, we're live. So it does look like there's maybe like a 10-second delay in between what we say live and what everyone's hearing on YouTube. So if it takes us a bit to reply, that's why. And what we're going to do is just really quickly run through the entry editor with late swap, explain how it works, and then just dive right into the questions. We've got a handful of questions that we're going to answer first that have been pre-submitted, but I'll be keeping an eye on the chat as well. And so if you have any questions at all, post your questions there, and I'll keep an eye on that. We'll try to get to those at the end. But yeah, we're really excited for you to join us. This is the third edition of Ask the Sharks after about like a 1-year hiatus or so. And we're going to dive into some advanced late swap strategies and answer all of the common questions around that. And you'll be able to watch this recording of this right on YouTube. I'm also going to get this edited up on our site as well. But yeah, the first thing we do is we've got a pretty nice, exciting surprise. I'm going to jump over to Matt's screen right here. We're going to do. We'll kick it off with Matt. Matt jumped in. This is his first Top Shot pack, which I know nothing about, other than Twitter is going nuts on it. So let's see what
just
this
people
is all
told
about.
me to jump in the queue, and I guess I got lucky. So I'm gonna open it. I have no idea.
So how do you figure out how much your card is worth once you get
the market
that might be for someone in the chat.
I'm not the person to ask about that. Oh, it's playing music now.
Oh, 6 of them.
Oh, yes.
All right, let's see.
Yeah.
Common.
Ooh, no, that's not
Damian Lillard is a Portland guy, though, Matt.
Dame is good.
Yeah, true. Common again. I'm probably gonna get
Who is
common.
that? Jackson Hayes. Oh, future superstar. That's cool.
Ooh, rare.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
all right.
Is this good, do you think?
Well, it's hard to see.
No idea, but
oh, it's like a game.
I wonder if it's because I think I chose Portland as like my team, so maybe they.
That was fishy, I think.
All right,
Tyler Hero. Sorry, is it? Did you get like 1 second bird?
If you know what's happening in the YouTube chat, please let us know.
I think I have
no idea.
I think your CJ McCollum card is possibly worth like over $1,000.
But so like but I think these packs, they had 1 rare. They were guaranteed to get 1 rare. I think.
Right.
I really.
Yeah.
Oh, are they? Okay.
All right. Let's see if you got rich.
Someone tell us how much the CJ McCollum rare is worth.
All
right.
Apparently, the Hero and the CJ are good.
Really?
Oh, really?
Miranda's trolling us right now, but that's okay. So, anyways, we'll look these up later. Matt's going to be counting his money on his yacht, I think, pretty soon.
Yeah.
But for now, though, let's just jump into what we really actually came here for, and it's to break down late swap. So, Matt, actually, I'll jump back over to your screen. Do you have SaberSim up?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's just I was just running a build, but
you've already got your entries reserved on Draftkings.
Yep.
And so do you want to just walk through the quick process there?
Sure. Yeah. So we put out a video last week or earlier this week, kind of going through the process, but I'm just going to do it again here, just on my entries for tonight, just to show you how easy it is to use the entry editor. So I ran a quick build just with default settings. I do need to make a couple changes. This is just kind of my dummy build, so I'm not going to put too much thought into it, but I'm just going to lower some of these top guys just to get, some more spread exposures. I really haven't looked at the slate much, so I'm going to lower some of these players just so I can make those changes. And this is, again, just like my placeholder build, so later on I'm going to do a real one where I put a little bit more thought into it, but I'm just going to save my lineups right here. Then I go to the entries tab, and it's for Draftkings. It's really easy. I just click this link. We automatically download the file.
As long as you're logged in, right?
As long as you're logged in to Draftkings. I'm just going to upload it here. And apparently I'm on the wrong slate or something. So yeah, I think I must have screwed something up there. But
yes, that's one of the things that will happen is where this is all controlled by is whether or not what slate you're on. And so if
Yeah.
you do get any errors, you always want to check the slate, make sure
Yeah, I
that
must have
the slate you're
done
building
something
for
wrong
is
there.
a slate that you've reserved entries for.
Yep.
And then Matt will get you onto the right one. And then
Yeah.
we can jump back into this.
All right. Let me just refresh the page here. I think maybe like my login expired or something.
All right, Matt, you can get that sorted out. And
Yes, I
basically,
will get it
though,
sorted
we do
out.
have some videos on how the entry editor works, how late swap works. And the reason why we call it the entry editor with late swap is because while, to be blunt, late swap, that functionality is going to give you a major edge on the field. The entry editor is a still pretty big part of this, and that's just going to make your life so much easier. So we don't want people to think just like this is like all the other late swap tools out there, because the way this works, it just dramatically simplifies the entry editing process, getting your entries into the right contests in seconds. You don't have to mess around with CSVs or anything like that. So Matt, are you good now?
Yeah, I'm good. I think I just needed to, I think my like session was expired, and so I just needed to refresh the page. So, typical, just refresh and it works. Yeah, so I just uploaded I literally just dragged my entries file into the screen. It uploaded the file. So I'm just going to do fill contests with lineups. For right now, I'm just going to go by rank. So that basically just fills like the top, however many lineups are in the contest. I'm going to put the top number of that lineups from my set into the contest. If I did unique, it would just randomly distribute them. But I'll just do rank for now. I click
so
fill.
what that's going to do is like in the 20 max contest, each of those will have the same 20. It'll be the top 20 from the build. Whereas the 150 max is going to have all 150. But yeah, if you did unique, that would randomly distribute them throughout. An exact match is in those cases where it's like you did a specific build for 20 max and you only want to fill those in contests with 20 entries.
Yeah. So then I'm just going to click download and open Draftkings. It'll automatically open my file. I just click upload here and I select my file and boom, done. So it's pretty easy to you just run a build and fill your contest with the lineups and then upload it. So I haven't edited my entries in a CSV or in Excel or Google Sheets in months since we've been testing this. So it's pretty great. Just like literally just not having to edit stuff in Excel is like well worth the money for me. But yeah.
And
Totally
I mean,
agree.
even with the hiccup at the beginning, this was still a faster process. But that's how you're going to get your lineups into the right contest when you're starting out the slate. And we always recommend after you reserve your contest that you get some real lineups in there, just in case anything happens, that you're not stuck with 150 of a dummy lineup in there.
Yeah.
And so from there, though, once the contests actually start, that's when late swap comes into play. And with late swap, you're able to quickly react to breaking news. And with that, why don't we just kind of talk a little bit more about that? Matt, I'm actually going to leave your screen up. Is that fine?
Yeah, fine with me.
All right. And so the first thing is there are a couple of options with late swap, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I think like the real first question is, when do you actually late swap? Is it only if one of your players is injured?
So not necessarily. You can do it that way. If you want to just use the late swap feature when you have a player that's out, that's totally reasonable. You're still getting edge over not doing that, obviously. You're certainly getting edge over just doing a global swap on DraftKings. So if you're short on time, you're just on your phone or you're out, away from your laptop and you just want to do a quick late swap if there's just major news, you can do that. For me, I generally will run late swaps before every single set of games lock. So, tonight I think there's some games at 4:30, and then there's some at 5, Pacific, and then a couple late ones as well. And so I'll probably run late swap before every set of games, assuming that projections update. So you can tell on our Slack channel, we have notifications when sims start and stop. You can also tell on this last updated timestamp if the projections have updated. And for me, I think any sort of edge that I can get from late swap, I want to take advantage of. So even if it's just, there were unexpected starters, or there's just some minor change in the projections, even if it's just a couple points here and there, I like to run it every time because, I want to take advantage of the up-to-date news, and it's really easy to run a late swap. So there's really no reason not to, unless I think the reasons not to actually are if you're, again, short on time and you just don't have the time to run the late swap before every lock, or if you've done a lot of changes to your builds, kind of post-build managing exposures, or if you've used our filter tool and unselected certain lineups, and you've done a lot of tinkering to your builds to really kind of get them to where you want to be, late swap will still account for your exposure adjustments. We'll still respect the min-max exposure, but if there's not huge changes, you don't necessarily need to run late swap before every game locks. It is extra time that you're having to spend during the evening to do that. And even though it's quick, it's still, I wouldn't say it's hugely necessary, but if you're, if you want to get the most out of the tool, I would say it's worth it to run before every set of games lock, assuming that our projections have updated.
And can I say something as well, Andy? I sort of see it as like a priority ladder, right? Like there's certain situations where you definitely want a late swap. This is when like there's an injured player that's unexpected that's actually in your lineups. That means you literally need to get that player out, and you're gonna late swap or do what are the feature that we have that's called quick swap. And then if there's a significant injury, that's a little below, but you're probably are going to want a late swap. When there's minor injuries, you could test it out. You can do a late swap. You can actually see how much your lineups have changed from it. And then you can say, okay, do I want to use this? Do I not want to use it? You don't have to use the late swap, but you can use this sort of test it out and just see, okay, how much are my lineups changing? Do I actually want to do this? But there's certain situations like, i.e., there's actually an injured player in your lineups where you're just going to definitely want to do it instead of just going to the Draftkings page and trying to manually do it yourself.
Yeah. I actually have some stuff to add on, if that's okay.
Yeah. Go for
it. So, I mean, just adding on to what Max said, I think basketball's a little unique in the sense that, like, if you're in the game, you're going to get some stats, and minutes tend to have like a much stronger, or playing time tends to have a much stronger correlation with fantasy points than in other sports. So if there's like some guys announce a surprise starter or there's a surprise injury, often the projections will change enough to where you're going to want a late swap. Now, for me personally, I tend to use late swap like about 50% of the time, and I don't run it before every game. But if there's a surprise starter or a surprise injury, then I think it absolutely makes sense to do it when that happens, because oftentimes you will have significantly different optimal lineups than you did before the lock.
And then any of you guys, are you changing how you build that initial foundation of lineups now that late swap is a bigger part of your game? It sounds like, Danny, you're using late swap more on a case-by-case basis. You're not kind of changing your entire process around it. But for Matt or Max, are you changing just how you're building lineups from the very beginning because of late swap?
Yeah, I can jump in. I definitely do it. If there's an early game, especially if there's an early value play that might not be as good of a value play if there's some injury later, I'm going to sort of just use these max and min ownership buttons places in the post-build process to actually like suppress some of these players' exposures in my lineups and increase it with players who are in later games, because that's going to give me the opportunity later to make a better late swap. If you use a guy who's like a pretty good value and use him a lot, and then he fails, and then there's just huge value opens up later, that's a huge missed opportunity that I want to be able to not miss. I want to take advantage of it. So absolutely.
Matt?
Yeah, I think I do probably a little bit less of the adjustments kind of in my initial build for late swap. I think the main thing for me is I just don't care that much about my exposures for the later games, so I don't need to, because I know that I'm going to be late swapping. I'm not going to be worrying too much about my exposure or projections for those later game players. which obviously it's not. I probably could be doing a little bit more strategy, like Max said, of having maybe more of the later game players or trying to take advantage of it. But I think a lot of, especially newer players, might see, for example, a questionable tag on LeBron James and lower his exposure because you don't want to, if he gets ruled out and you don't want to get caught with a bunch of LeBron James that you're trying to swap out. But with late swap, there's really not much of a reason to do that unless it's really like that's the only game at the end of the slate. There's no other options at that price point. Then you might want to think about, okay, maybe I'm going to be stuck with no other options. But especially, for a slate tonight, like tonight, where there's, I think, 2 games late, and there's probably other players that we can swap to, especially, with Portland. I'm sure we could do some swaps there. I wouldn't care about having 50% LeBron James in my initial build, even if he's questionable, even if he's unlikely to play. That might make me even more want to have a lot of him, just because his ownership is going to be so deflated. And I think, from just anecdotally, anytime I see that questionable tag on a player and then I look at their ownership later on in the slate, it's always way lower than it should be. So I think for me, it's just more, I don't make the changes that I might have without late swap.
And then, are you ever? I guess it's not like technically late swap at this point, but like, are you ever using the late swap functionality before lock?
No, I don't. I think there's not, unless you're really tight on time and you want to, so right now I don't have any exposure caps, but if I had set some min and max exposures on my build, those would carry over here. And so if I had set a bunch of those and I don't want to redo, I just want to like swap with my same exposures based on the new news, I might do that. I might also do a quick swap if, say, I have my lineups and somebody from an early game is a late scratch, and so 2 minutes before lock, somebody, Embiid or something, gets ruled out, and I just need to like really quickly get them out of my lineups. That's when I would use maybe quick swap. But for the most part, I would just run a new build and apply it, just use the fill contest with lineups and apply it rather than using late swap if it's before lock.
And then just quickly, I want to touch on the different swap methods. I know we've danced around it a little bit, but we have quick swap and late swap. And Matt, can you just we don't need to go super deep into this, but can you just explain a little bit about how they work and how you actually choose which one to use?
Yeah, so, again, I went over it a little bit in our other video. Usually for quick swap, what I will do is, so I rarely use quick swap as
what is quick swap?
So sorry, yeah. First of all, quick swap is basically like a better version of DraftKings or FanDuel's global swap. So essentially, we will, I'll open it up. We will look for all out players. So if you just go by default, we'll take all out players that are in your lineups and we will replace them with the next best available player for whatever position they're in. So again, say LeBron James gets ruled out, I would just do this quick swap. It would just replace LeBron in every lineup with the next best player for that lineup. So it might not be the same player in all of them. It might be a different player in half the lineups and another one in the other half. But it's basically a really quick way. So we don't have to rebuild all the lineups. It's only affecting the lineups that have that player. So for me,
and it's also going lineup by lineup. So with the global swap tools on DraftKings, FanDuel, assuming Yahoo, the way it works is you pick a replacement for it, and so you have to pick a player typically who's under, who has less salary than the player you're replacing, or if you pick someone that's over. Again, either way, it's going to blanket replace that person in all of your lineups. So either you're going to be leaving a lot of money on the table, or it's not going to work on a lot of lineups. So what we'll do is lineup by lineup, figure out how much salary you have left and maximize that use, and then show you who got in, who got out, and all of that.
Hey, I have a question. How quickly do we get the out status updates? And is it possible to designate a player as out if they don't have an out status?
Yeah, so we get those status updates very quickly. So, the sim itself that updates the projections can take take a little bit longer because, a player being out will affect the rest of the game or rest of the team, certainly. But in terms of the actual out status, we'll get that very quickly. So if a player gets ruled out within, a minute or two, really, you can go to quick swap and just use the all out players. But you can also just, if you uncheck a player, so if I just uncheck LeBron here, or if I set his projection to 0, and then I go to quick swap and I just apply it'll actually, I guess maybe Justice Winslow got ruled out since I built these, but yeah, but like it'll, and actually with LeBron, like there might not have been, anyway, it'll remove him from all of your lineups.
If you set the projection
probably
to
I would
0.
I think it's setting it to 0. It's not the unchecking because that kind of affects, that's like the max exposure. But yeah, if you set him to 0, you run the quick swap, it'll swap him out of all your lineups. But generally, like if he was ruled out, if I just clicked refresh projections, or even if you're on another page and you go to entries, it'll update him, mark him as out, and then you just have to do the quick swap. And again, that's generally not like the last swap that I'll do. I'll do that right after the news comes out, just to make sure I get him out of the lineups. And then once the sims update, then I'll do a late swap, which will actually rebuild all the lineups so that, you can get more of the other Lakers that benefit from him being out and get the full benefit of that tool rather than, just the quick swap, which I think the value is more just having the really quick changes there.
Yeah, and so before we jump into the full late swap, a couple things I just want to touch on is to Danny's point, we will update as we're always investing in faster and better sources of data. We're very happy with where our injury news setup is right now, and so we'll react very quickly by throwing up the out status tag as soon as we get that information. However, because the way we create our projections is by simulating them out thousands of times, it's going to take sometimes 5 or 10 minutes to get fully updated projections. But yeah, in those cases, if it's really tight, we do speed up the process. But yeah, it's you can trust us that we'll update the out as fast as possible. One actually related question we got on this is that if I swap a player out, does it only change that player at that position, or does it optimize the entire lineup and switch out other players in the lineup as well? And so that was from Jeff. And for that question, if you are using quick swap, while we will use as much salary from each individual lineup, it is only handling that specific player, and it will not touch the rest of your lineup. And that's where the full late swap functionality really comes in. And Matt, if you want to just touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so like Andy said, the quick swap will only swap out that one out player. With late swap, what we're doing is we kind of send all of those lineups to the builder, and the builder is going to lock in the players whose games have already started, so they're locked into your lineups, and then basically the rest of the lineup we'll just rebuild based on the new projections and all of your other settings. So we do account for correlation and ownership, and we use the smart diversity with the sims in the same way. So if you run late swap, all we're going to do is just lock in those players that obviously can't be moved because their games have started, and then the rest of the lineup will change, and then we'll do that individually with every single lineup that you have, and make sure that they're unique so that you're not going to have duplicate lineups. If the best possible lineup is the same for two of them, we'll make sure that they're unique, just like with your original build. So you end up with 150 or however many lineups you swapped, you'll end up with a new set of lineups that account for all of the changes in projections. So we're essentially re-optimizing, rebuilding those lineups.
And for this, can you actually open up what the late swap dialog looks like?
Yeah.
And so it looks identical pretty much to the standard build dialog. And there's a few questions that have come up in the chat right now, and also were emailed in. And the first one I would want to just bring up is, like, when we get to the screen, what should we be thinking about, even before this, of just, should we be doing different late swaps for each contest you're playing, or just a blanket late swap for everything?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of it depends on your time, and then it also kind of depends on the nature of the swap and the players that are that changed. So if you have time, if you have, however long it doesn't take that long to run the swaps, but so if you have time and you want to do a different swap for each of your contests, especially if you had done different builds for each of them, then I think that's great. And that's probably going to give you even better lineups, because we've set these default settings based on the size of the contest and the entry limit. So if you want to really get the most out of late swap, I think you can run a different one for each contest. For me personally, because I'm generally entering a lot of different contests, and because there are sims running all the time, and so sometimes there's only 5 minutes left before I need to get the lineups in, and so I usually will just run a single late swap. And I think really, especially when there's big news, if there's a major player injury and you have, suddenly new value that's popping up, I don't care too much about those differences between the slider settings, because that's so much less important than the value you're getting from the new projections and, the new players that suddenly you have a lot of leverage from. So again, it really just depends. If you're doing a different build for each of your contests initially, and you have the time to do that for late swap, by all means, do that. Just keep in mind that there is a time constraint, and if you're short on time and you just want to do a single late swap for all your contests, there's nothing wrong with that, and you'll still get a lot of edge if there's that big news and you're accounting for that.
And one thing we should have touched on in the last question, but it does apply here as well, is a lot of this, whether it's just late swap or just how you're actually building your lineups, comes down to time. If you are a professional and have all day and are playing a sport like NFL or baseball, where you typically have a good amount of time between when the final confirmed lineups and the game starts, yeah, you should be doing separate builds for the different contest types and getting as precise as you can, because all those customizations will add edge to your strategy. But if you're doing this on the side, if you're doing it for sport like NBA, where you just simply don't have that much time, you've got to make compromises. And so what we always recommend when it comes between quick swap and late swap is, if someone was ruled out, always do a quick swap. It's the same reason why we replace dummy lineups right away, is you just want to, as insurance, make sure you're not going to be screwed if you don't have enough time to get the full swap in or anything else. So always do quick swap, always upload those lineups as soon as someone is out, and then see what you have time for. And I would say do a late swap build across all of your contests, then get that in if you have time. And then if there's still a little bit more time left, you could pick, say, your higher dollar buy-in contests and do a specific swap for those. And it's really just fitting the process into how much time you have available, based on minimizing risk, and then based on just getting the most customization and effort into those higher dollar contests.
Yep.
And someone just asked, I think we covered it here, but I just want to make sure we did. Someone just said, what happens when I have multiple contests going with different settings? Are all the late swaps using the same slider settings? And they will be, unless you do separate swaps by selecting the contest and then going to the late swap. And building on this, the next question is about the sliders and what sliders should I use for late swap. And before you jump in, Matt, I just want to give some context in that. What is going to happen when you open this is that it will pull in the sliders from your most recent build to give you as a starting point. You can make adjustments, but the starting point of what you see will be the sliders from your most recent build. And then from there, Matt, are you making any adjustments, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think by default, I'm not making too many adjustments to the sliders for late swap if there hasn't been big news. So I will usually make minor changes as the slate progresses. As there becomes fewer and fewer games left, you don't need the smart diversity as much, because we have fewer players to choose from, and any changes to projections that there have been, we kind of want to take advantage. The whole point of late swap is to get the edge from taking advantage of those changes. And so the lower the smart diversity, the more you're accounting for those for projection. So especially if there are big changes where there's a major player that's ruled out or a surprise starter, I will lower smart diversity, especially a lot, because I want to make sure that I'm getting as much leverage out of that player as I can. But even without those major changes, I'll usually lower sliders a little bit as the slate progresses, just because, you know, the diversity doesn't matter as much when there's fewer players to diversify. And then with ownership fade, because, you know, ownership is important as a whole, but as we get later into the slate, the ownership of those players is less important, I think, than the edge you're getting from the projection changes. So if I would recommend personally, if there's a big, you know, big news, you know, LeBron gets ruled out and you want to account for that change, I would just set ownership fade to 0 and set a low smart diversity, because I mean, I might even just set them all to the left, because you want to really just get as much of the projection edge as possible from, you know, the new starters, rather than trying to diversify too much and trying to, you know, get too cute sort of with the sims. You just want to really get that leverage.
Yeah, I'd love to add on to this, because I think one thing is, just to clarify, your lineups probably are not going to be like tremendously different whether you kept the settings that Matt was just at, or you do it to 0 in a late swap scenario. Because let's say, you know, it's 7 o'clock Pacific time, there's 2 more games left, and we're swapping your lineups. It's the difference between, if someone's way better, he's going to be way better in the majority of the sims, and using our simulation data, it's going to come to mostly the same conclusion. And so it's not I don't think it's a huge deal personally, but this is sort of more advanced stuff of how much you want to consider our simulations versus how much you want to consider average projection when doing a late swap. If you want to consider average projection more, you're going to move the sliders to the left. If you want to consider our simulations data more, you're going to move the sliders to the right. And so it just depends on what you want to do. And sometimes it makes sense, right? What Matt is saying is, in the later games where you might just want to do a late swap based mostly on average projection, and that's fine. In that case, you want to move the sliders more to the left.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to touch on a couple of questions that come up in chat that I think are relevant here. So David had asked, do the projections auto update, or do you need to manually refresh? The projections will update if you close out of the app and like you did your build earlier on in the day, came back, opened up a new tab, and load up the site. The projections will change. But if you've left the tab up, you do need to refresh your projections, which you can do by just hitting the refresh icon in the upper right. Super Sloth asked, nothing seems to happen when I change min-max exposures in the entries. And so just one thing to point out is that this looks practically identical to the build page for the exposures table, but we don't change the exposures of players live on this page. If you change the min and max exposures from the entry editor, they will not change until you do a late swap rebuild. So what we'll do is we'll pull in all the information you have for the min and max exposure columns here and do our best to match that when we rebuild the lineups using late swap. And then Jeff also asked, or Matt, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on that a little bit, because I don't think I've mentioned it. With late swap, so for normal builds, the way that our min-max exposure works is that we build a pool of, 500 to 1,500 lineups, and then we sort those and filter those down. So when you set min-max exposures, what you're really doing for a normal build is you're starting from that pool of 1,500, and then you're kind of filtering those so that you're pulling different sets of lineups from that pool to get your final, 150 or 20 or however many you want. For late swap, we don't build that whole pool. We swap the however many lineups you actually have in your entries. And so when you set this min-max exposure, we don't have a pool to draw from. We are just sending those exposure, those exposure settings to the builder when you run the late swap, and then the builder is accounting for that as it builds. So it's just I just wanted to kind of clarify that part of it because it is, it's not, it might not be fully apparent off the bat that it's a little bit of a different process where late swap is not just pulling from that big pool of lineups like a normal build.
Yeah, and Jeff had also asked, every time I late swap, almost all of my lineups change. Is that normal? And Max kind of touched on this a bit, where the changes shouldn't be major, but especially if the earlier on it is, most lineups probably will have some changes. So that is normal. And the higher the smart diversity is going to be, and the further away, like the earlier you are in the slate, the bigger the changes may be. But yeah, I wouldn't get too concerned about that. And then, yeah, let's jump into kind of one of the technical questions. So it's, does late swap use projected score or saber score to pick lineups, and is there a way to control this?
Yeah, so this actually is very similar to what I was just explaining about the lineup pool. So essentially how the builder works normally, not for late swap, but just for normal builds, is that you'll set your settings for correlation, ownership, and smart diversity, and then the builder will take those settings and it'll account for those settings as it's building. So it's going to incorporate correlation into your lineups, and it'll incorporate ownership fade into the lineups, and the smart diversity kind of controls how, like, the sample of the sims that we're pulling from as when we're creating those. So that's already accounting for those sliders, and that's sort of like, in a way, that is accounting for saber score. The other way that we account for these sliders is post build. After we build those 1,500 lineups for your pool, we then will rate each lineup based on, we'll just have their projected score, which is just the sum of the projections for the players, and then we'll have the saber score, which accounts for these three sliders. And the saber score and prod score are used to like sort and filter your full lineup pool to determine which of your 1,500 lineups is actually going to be in your selected lineup set. So that's kind of the background into how the saber score works. For late swap, because we don't build the whole lineup pool, saber score and prod score don't really matter. So it's actually, the answer is sort of neither. Because we're not doing any sorting of a lineup pool with late swap, all that matters is how they're being built. So we are building the lineups based on ownership and correlation and based on those slider settings. So in a way, I guess it's closer to saber score because we do account for those settings, but we're not sorting them in any different way. We're literally just taking each lineup and rebuilding it based on the settings that you provide and the players that are locked.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, yeah, if you want control of that and don't want any of those factors to play a role, you can just turn on cache mode or just manually put all of the sliders to off like that. And then it'll just use projections from there. All right, so another question we have is, if I tweak exposure settings after build and then do a late swap, will those same exposure settings apply during the late swap build? And so he's basically saying, like, I think they're asking.
I think he's saying if you do adjust your exposures in your swap or in your lineups before lock, and then after like an hour later do late swap, do those same exposure settings apply to the late swap?
Like, are we pulling in the exposure settings from the time when you submitted your lineups, or from whatever is the most recent thing in the most recent build?
So it's from the most recent. So essentially, if you set a bunch of exposure settings in your build and then you go to the entries tab, we'll pull in those exposures. When you fill contests with a lineup set, we will fill from whatever your exposures were for those lineups. We will populate the exposures from that lineup set into the entries tab, so that when you run a late swap, it will keep those exposure settings. So it'll be based on the latest exposure changes that you've made.
Okay, so to be clear, if I do a build, save my lineup set, got that in there, but I then change the exposures in the build without saving it, will those new exposures get pulled into the entry editor, or only if I save the lineup set?
I believe it'll only be if you save the lineup set. It'll be once you actually fill the contest with that lineup set, then it'll pull in
That's when
those
it gets pulled
exposures
in.
from. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the very first time you do it, it'll pull in whatever your most recent exposure changes were. But for like if you fill with future lineup sets, it'll just be based on whatever the exposures were from that newest lineup set. Yeah.
Okay. And so basically, if once you've filled the lineups, filled the entries with the lineups, and you've got all that set, you shouldn't if you want to keep tweaking exposures, you probably shouldn't do that within the build unless you're going to refill your entries with those latest changes. And like, if you do want to make more changes, I would do it in the entry editor. Is that fair to say, Matt?
Yeah. Sorry, were you talking about before lock or post lock?
I guess that does make a difference. Yeah. So
like after lock, then you can't really do, you're not going to be doing normal builds. You're only going to be working within late swap, and then all of your exposure changes are going to be on this entries tab rather than within the build. If it's before lock, then you just want to, if you're doing these exposure changes, just make sure that once you're done, you save your lineups and you go and you fill your contest with your lineups that you just saved, and that'll populate these exposures so that when you get to the late swap step later, after lock, if something changes, we'll have those exposures here for when you run your late swap. But I would just make sure that you're careful with that, because if there's a player that maybe you would set a max exposure for the player and then suddenly they're announced starting and their projection goes up, you want to have more of that player, and so you just want to make sure that if you set those caps that you're adjusting for that, if the projections change and you end up wanting more of that player.
all right. And then this next one is the last one we have this pre-submitted. So if you're tuning in and we haven't gotten your question yet, dump that into the chat and we'll get to that soon. But the last one we've got here is in a similar vein where it's, I can't get my exposures or rules dialed in the way I want when I do late swap. How do you handle this?
So for me, one thing you can do is just focus more on projection than on the exposure. Sometimes it's easier if you're just getting way too much of a player that more than you're comfortable with. It might be easier to look at the projection and see, okay, why am I getting so much of this player? Do I need to lower the projection to help with that? The other thing is that sometimes, if there aren't that many games to swap, it can be hard to get the exact exposures that you want because some of your lineups just aren't very swappable, or it's hard to get those exact exposures. One thing you can do is mess with make your settings less restrictive so that when you do your late swap, maybe lower your min salary a bit. So if you would set it, maybe you would set it to 49,500, and so we're not able to swap some of your lineups to get within the exposures that you want because there's not enough salary. You can lower your min salary, maybe lower your min projection, try to get a bigger pool of players to pull from. So that's something that I would try. Messing with the player projections and see if you can, maybe get a little bit more or less of a player that way. I don't know if Max and Danny, you have any thoughts?
Yeah,
there?
I think the thing is, like, if a game has already started, a player's going to be locked. So we're working within restrictions, and sometimes you can't get exposures you want.
Right.
Like, if everyone's game has started in a lineup, we're not going to be able to late swap your favorite player into that lineup because there's literally nowhere to put him. If there's only like a few places, if you really like a center that is benefited from some injury and you already have all your centers who you played their game started, like, you're not going to be able to get exposure to that person or get a lot. So there's just a lot of constraints. So it's going to be hard to get exposures exactly right in a late swap for sure. And I think you have to worry about that less.
Especially on FanDuel, where there's not the multi-position eligibility, so it's a lot harder to fit in exactly what you want.
Yes.
Right. And one thing that is important to point out is that if you do find it important in your build process to have a lot of rules and really control exactly how the lineups are built, that's fine. But yeah, you have to understand that as the remaining options become fewer and fewer, there's less to do. But what makes SaberSim's late swappers so different than the other tools is that with traditional late swap tools, they say you have 150 lineups and they're going to try to swap all 150 following the rules that you put in. If they can't, you are not going to get any lineups back. It'll say you couldn't do it. Whereas what we'll do is we will rebuild and late swap as many of the lineups as we can while honoring your rules and your salary ranges and everything else. And then when we hit a wall and there's no more left for us to build following that, we'll throw up a message that says, hey, we were able to rebuild 70 out of those 150. Do you want us to, for this last 80, rebuild your lineups without those restrictions? And so what that will do is let you get as close as mathematically possible to the rules you had in place before throwing them out. And so it's not an all or nothing proposition like it is with other tools. And that's one of the big things we really do want to stress with this is that if you want that extra control, we'll let you get as much of that as you can. But when math just says that's it, then we'll build the rest in whatever way possible. But yeah, did you guys have anything else to add to that one?
Nope.
Max, I think you're muted.
Max, you're muted.
I would love to build on a question that someone asked earlier, if that's okay to talk about something.
Sure. Yeah.
So one thing that the entry editor can do as well is, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but maybe we didn't, is you can actually just do a late swap for specific contests, right? Like you could say,
yeah,
I just want to do a late swap for the mini max, or I just want to do a late swap for my single entry or whatever, right? And so the question is A, can you do that? And B, do we want to do that? And when would you do that? Do you get what I'm asking?
Yeah, Matt, do you want to? So I think we touched on that a little bit. Where just to summarize what we were saying before, is that if you had an unlimited amount of time, you would want to be as precise with your late swaps as possible and do them for specific contests at that, and have different sliders for each of them. But it's finding that balance based on how much time you have available, whether it's because lock is, or not lock, but like tip off is coming right up, or because you just simply don't have that much time. Maybe dinner's coming up. But Matt, do you want to show how people actually do that?
Right. I would love to just demonstrate, like, how do you do it for just a specific contest, or how do we make that?
Yeah. So, right. So it's pretty easy. So we'll late swap just based on whatever contest is checked here. So I can uncheck and like just check the mini max and then run a late swap just for that. And that'll just swap the mini max. Maybe I'll check all of them and, or I'll just want to run it for like a single entry or something. I can check my single entry contests and swap that way. And then I'm just swapping for the single entry contest. So it's pretty easy to do that way. And so, yeah, if you have the time, and then you can change your settings and, only, run it based on the single entry settings, which are, more conservative with smart diversity and ownership because they're smaller contests. So yeah, that's how I would do that.
And we also sort of categorize your entries for you as well, right? You can say just do it for satellites, just do it for GPPs, just do it for, right?
Yep. So you can choose it from the drop down here. I generally don't play cash, but if you play cash, you can just select cash and then run your late swap just for that contest type as well. That's probably that would be the simplest way of doing it. So that's kind of the in between just doing one late swap for everything and doing one for each individual contest, was just base it off of the type of contest. It's cash especially, you really want to have different settings there. So if you're running GPP lineups and cash, I would recommend doing different late swaps unless you really have no time. I would separate those out because obviously for cash, you just kind of want the best projected lineup period. And for GPP, you want to care more about those other factors.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and again, this is part of the reason why it took almost a year of active development to really get this dialed in. Is there's so much nuance to late swap. You don't want to just do the same thing for all of your contests every single time. In some cases, when that's all the time you have, that's what you want to do. But we wanted to find a way to give you the control to see, okay, I'm going to swap. I don't have any time. I'm going to swap everything very quickly with quick swap, or I got a little bit more time. I'm going to do a full late swap on all of it. Or, hey, I've got 10 minutes. That's enough for me to do a separate build for cash. And then I can even break down my higher buy-in GPPs to my lower buy-ins or 20 max or whatever it is. Like, we really wanted to give you as much control as possible here. One other question that one Swift had asked actually earlier on, and it's kind of more on the entry editor side, but just general DFS strategy. So I'm curious to get your takes on this. I'll start with just my take, but it's, should I put the same 20 lineups in each 20 max contest, or go contest by contest? One 20 max may have 10,000 entrants while the other has 80,000. And I think this just kind of drills home the point that it depends on how much time you have. Like, in a perfect world, I would at least not necessarily put different lineups in it, but I would use different build settings to create those lineups if I had time to do that. But yeah, to me, it's all just a balance of how much time you have available. The more precision you can get with how you're building your lineups and catering them to each contest type, and each contest style, number of entrants, all of that, the better. But there's going to be trade-offs there. And some of the edges are going to be smaller. Like between 10,000 and 80,000, that like is relatively big. But like between a 10K entry contest and a 20,000 one, it's like, I'd probably just put the same in. How do you guys feel about that?
I can answer. I usually just do one. I don't play cash, so I think if you're playing cash, you definitely should do, well, actually, maybe even not. You don't necessarily need to do that, but I would probably do a different one for cash than I do for my GPP build. But in general, like, the strategy for a 20 max GPP that has 1,000 people versus 50,000, it's different. It's not so different that I'm pinching pennies trying to like do so much. If you do it like getting a late swap the way we do it, period, is such an edge that I'm not worried about just like extending it by just so little to do it that granularly. But it's more profitable. Sure, it just depends on the time. I agree.
Yeah, and most people have limited amounts of time, regardless of what that may be. Everyone has a certain amount of time that they can spend on it, and like, that's when it's picking and choosing your battles. And I think cash versus GPP, you probably should have a different build for those. When it gets down within the GPPs, it's marginal, but I'm sure it makes a difference. But then it's like, all right, like, will spending more time up front eat into the time you can spend later on? Because if so, don't do that. Like, save that extra time for the late swap where you're going to get more of an edge. And like, if trying to get a dozen different builds in your GPPs takes away time from doing research and adjusting projections, I probably wouldn't do that either. It's all a balance of what adjustments give me the most leverage and give me the most edge on the field. And generally speaking, you're not going to see major changes for any of the GPPs from one build setting to the next. But like, dialing in the projections a bit will make a significant improvement across all of your builds and so on. So it's just picking and choosing. But yeah, in a perfect world, you would have enough time to do all these things, and it really just depends there. And yeah, so I guess to just clarify a little bit, you said late swap aside, do you do an additional build differently for the different size contests that are the same max entries? And I think that we're kind of talking about late swap aside already, where it's just in that first build, it's pick the amount of time that you've got available and then balance where you spend that time. And I would personally say, sure, separate cash from GPP as a rule of thumb. And then rather than breaking down GPPs into 6 different builds, I would probably rather spend that time adjusting projections. but it's up to you. But yeah, Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, like, so for me, I think the sport does matter here. So I think for NBA, there's much less reason to do that because, you know, like, first of all, I know we're saying late swap aside, but I think late swap is important because if you're going to be changing your builds and your lineups throughout the night, there's just not as much value. You know, any of those minor changes between the contests like might just be kind of a moot point by the time you're doing those late swaps. And then the news can change so much that you might run a different build for all your contests, and then 5 minutes before lock, news comes out, and you just have to, all that work is kind of down the drain. So, you know, because NBA, there's just so much changing, and because it's nightly, and, you know, for me, I'm not, you know, I'm working at SaberSim full time. I'm doing development work and all this stuff. When I'm actually playing DFS, I spend very little time on it. So I'm generally like Max, where I'm just doing mostly like a single build because I think the edge that I'm getting from late swap and just from the value of the builder itself is worth it. But for a sport like NFL, I think the answer is very different. One, you have an entire week between slates, so you have time. The projections aren't changing that much unless there's, you know, a major questionable player or something. But for the most part, you know, you have the basic projections ready, you know, the weekend before or the night before. And so you can really dial in your builds based on the contest that you're entering. And with NFL, you know, you have a Millie Maker, which is 200, 300,000 entries. That's going to be a very different strategy than a contest that's even 20,000 entries. So I think you get more value out of adjusting your builds that way. So I think it really, you know, and even MLB might be similar, though, with the lineups coming out so close to lock. I don't know. I probably for MLB I would just do a single build, but again, there's more reason, and because ownership is so important for MLB, you know, with a bigger contest, you might want to really focus more on ownership, whereas a smaller contest, you just want to go by the projections. So again, I think NBA is a little bit unique in those settings between bills of, you know, you one or two ticks down in smart diversity or up in ownership fade aren't going to make that big of a difference at the end of the night compared to the projections and the late swap.
Perfect. And I think we got to everything. If I missed anything in the chat, let me know. But if you have any other questions at all about this or anything else regarding the lineup building process, you can always reach out to us at support@sabersim.com, and we're happy to help. If you'd like what you saw today and you don't already have the entry editor, you can sign up for a free trial at sabersim.com and try the entry editor completely free, as well as all of our other tools. And if you already do have a SaberSim account, you can also just go to the entries tab and start a free trial right from there. Again, we're always happy to help with any questions that you may have. The easiest way to get a hold of us is going to be support@sabersim.com. I'm going to work to get this. This should actually just automatically go up to YouTube right after we're done here. But we'll clean it up and separate out the questions this weekend and get it up so that if you want to kind of review any of this, you can always find those questions there. But thanks for the time. Thanks, guys, for joining us. It was a lot of fun. And we'll probably make this a regular thing. So hopefully you'll see us back in the next month or so. All right. See you, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.